That's the thing that I think we've got to keep looking at is how do we invite and embrace people in, but also how do we empower people to also push back on us as leaders? Because,
Are you performing what you're saying, or are you genuinely living it? And there is a difference, and I think that the more that you actually start to be curious around what that actually means, the more you actually recognize that there are learnt behaviours that we assume is actually authentic, but they're default patternings that we don't even recognise.
being a leader is actually very energy draining because you are not only worrying about where you're going, you're worrying about where everyone else is going, where your environment's going.
When you make a decision and when you look back at the last breath that you take, what is it that you actually want to say? That, yes, I've done.
This is Let's Pay Attention, Hacking Consciousness. I'm Cathy Dimarchos. Let's explore what it means to lead, live, and listen with intention.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Pay Attention. My next guest actually is going to allow us to perhaps have a different lens of the way that we actually operate within the environments that we work in and also within the environments that we live. Let's Pay Attention is all about us being a little bit more attentive to what is actually happening as opposed to the way that we just autopilot through life. So please actually allow me to introduce to you my next guest. So this is Adam Awty. He's actually the CEO of the Law Institute of Victoria. He was appointed in 2018. His actual leadership really is grounded in understanding that systems, policy and people are really inseparable, and that meaningful progress occurs when all three are actually shaped within a human-centred environment. With deep experience across membership associations and the non-for-profit sector, Adam brings strength in finance, governance and strategic leadership. Leading a team of around 100 staff, he focuses on strengthening the LIV's relevance while ensuring that the legal profession continues to evolve in service of the community. Known for navigating complexity with both clarity and empathy, Adam works at the intersection of structure and lived experience, recognising that policy must translate into human outcomes. His career actually includes 18 years at the CPA Australia, including interim CEO, alongside board roles across government and non-profit sectors. He is currently a director of Legal Super. Now, outside of work, Adam has a different side to him. He enjoys pottery, tending to his hobby farm, cooking for family and friends. So you'll have to take him up on that. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks, Cathy. Good to be with you this morning.
It's always actually a joy to speak with you, Adam. I think you do genuinely bring a really different perspective to the way that I think we generally look at life, and also, I guess, how we engage, not just on a personal note, but also professionally. So if you don't mind, I might actually just throw you straight into the deep end. You know how I work. I guess the question that I have for you is, how does consciousness really actually show up in your leadership, given your actual experience and also in life? What does that look like?
It's an interesting question, Cathy. And, I'd probably say that I've been working now for 3 decades. I reckon for a long part of that, it was unconscious consciousness. And by that, you navigate yourself through life, through your career, through work, and you don't actually necessarily realise the why or the what or the how and all of those things that sort of sit underneath and around that. And it's only been, I suppose, as I started to move more into leadership roles, you start to think more broadly about why, what's the impact that you're trying to have, what's the impact you are having, particularly when it comes to people. What does that actually lead to in terms of how you actually want to represent yourself? And one of the things that I suppose really has come more and more into focus to me over the last, probably 10 to 15 years is, again, having, seen some remarkable leaders, work with remarkable leaders, is how does that come about in an authentic context, because being conscious in how you lead, I think people can say they are conscious in how they lead, but how does that actually present in terms of authenticity? And to me, authenticity is one of the things that I am constantly trying to grapple with as a leader, as to when I do something, how does that manifest out in a week, in 2 weeks' time? Is what I'm saying true to what I'm doing? Is the impact I am trying to achieve actually having the right outcome? And being true to yourself in that context, I think, is one of the things I always continue to check myself on, but also continue to explore.
I think, it's something that I certainly actually look at. I reference it perhaps more to performance. Are you performing what you're saying, or are you genuinely living it? And there is a difference. And I think that the more that you actually start to be curious around what that actually means, the more you actually recognize that there are learnt behaviours that we assume is actually authentic, but they're default patternings that we don't even recognise. And so you raise some, really valid points there. And I think particularly in the environment that, we're currently in, but also actually leading into with that fast pace, it's easy to actually go into that autopilot, And so particularly in the industry that you're in, everybody's on the clock. The profession, actually needs to perform as such to that 6-minute interval, So how do we actually enable them to be more of who they actually are and allow that centered person, or that centered person approach come into the way that they do business, when really, as a business, there's also an obligation, to provide that return on investment that everybody's so focused on. How do we do that?
Well, it's an interesting question. And again, one of the things you touched on, I'll answer that in 2 parts. The first bit you touched on was around performative. And I often think around, and I do look at this more and more, even in my own way I present and also how other leaders present. Is it performative? Are they just words? Or is this, context and authenticity and actual genuineness behind it? I think the challenge in a profession like the law, and one of the things, and I will go out and speak to members across the profession, quite regularly. One of the things I regularly say to them is, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an accountant by profession. I love my profession. It's given me a good grounding to do what I do, but I actually care more about the legal profession than I do my own, in the context of the work that they do. They have to bring their genuine self to it. And if anything, the challenge for them is, how do they protect themselves in bringing their genuine self to it? Because the law, a lot of areas, the law, and again, I will probably age myself, the law is not LA law. Yes, there's a lot of work that's in the commercial space and in the big M&As and the big deals and all that sort of stuff. Bulk of the professional law is actually dealing with everyday humans, with everyday human-centered problems. It's whether someone's relationship is coming to an end, someone's loved one has passed away, or there's some trauma, involved in it. A lot of the work the profession actually does, they need to be authentic to actually make their clients feel comfortable, but they also need to be able to put not a barrier, but they need to protect themselves, because a lot of what they're doing can be classed as vicarious trauma, because they're having to actually take on, the stories and narrative of very complex situations, very complex people, but they can't make it theirs. So the profession like the law is, how do you not lose who you are, and while protecting yourself in that context, to enable you to keep turning up day in, day out for your clients, for your community, because lawyers are really trying to do the right thing, and it's a hard thing for them to sometimes separate themselves from that. And that's why I admire them, is because they will go in and do stuff most of us ordinary, everyday Australians probably don't want to deal with.
Before you jump into the second part that you're going to answer, can I actually just, as I was listening to you, what you reminded me of is almost the training that I got a couple of decades ago, when I was actually studying as a psychotherapist counsellor. that actual piece that you share about being able to be human-centered in, that situation that's actually in front of you, with the people that, you're there actually to serve is so relevant. And you're right, they're not trained. And yet what they're involved in is so personal and so deep. And so that bonding of trust actually needs for them to be their authentic self. Yet they have an obligation to actually keep that boundary and not judge and actually serve, the very people that they're in front of. That actually raises, and I've never really thought about that, but it is such a valid point, and something that perhaps we might be able to, bring into the fold in how do they do that? Because, that's 4-year degree doing counselling, psychotherapy, and it's 4-6 years in the legal profession. You can't study for 10 years. Right.
No, and that's genuinely, and that's one of the things that, we have been talking about, within our LIV about is how do we support the whole person in the profession? Because the technical skills are important, because if you go to a lawyer, you want to know that they are technically competent to get you the best outcome that you can in the circumstances. And that could be at one end keeping you out of jail if it's appropriate, or getting you the best financial settlement, maybe, in a divorce or whatever it might be. But all of those interactions, you are dealing with a person. And that person, each person is individual. Each person comes with their own story, their own narrative. So how do you keep your professional boundaries, which they're required to do, in the context of being a lawyer, but how do you make sure you can actually still give that trust and build that trust while having that appropriate separation of your boundaries? And we're actually doing work with the profession around conscious leadership, around wellbeing, around all of those things that said, how are you looking after you to turn up to be the best you can for your client and the next client? Because you need to be sustainable for you, and that's an important part of it.
And I do love that you're actually doing, a whole body of work around conscious leadership. I think when I attended, last year's conference, one of the actual sessions was focused on ethics. And you have an entire team that actually, focuses and provides support in that particular area. And it is so integral. I don't think people just realise how important that piece is, ethics, and how we actually interpret that without bias. And I think the LIV actually does a great job in that regard. And it's not just the law, profession that actually requires that. I think it's industry as a whole. And so maybe, what if I can actually jump into the systems piece, because I think the law actually sits at the intersection of just about every single aspect of any industry.
Of society at large.
Yeah, right. And so you're really actually at the intersection of community, systems, government and policy. And so it plays such an integral role, and especially where consciousness actually comes into play. What are some of the discussions that we can actually have to bring more awareness into that space, not as a process, but as a lived experience?
Well, it's a good question, Cathy, and it's one that I'm increasingly having conversations around, because the law is part of a system. And it's a system of our democracy. It's a system of how society knows where the rules are around what you can and you can't do. It's about the system that provides certainty as to outcomes if you do the right thing or the wrong thing. But it also is it is society's checkpoint on individual behaviour in the society, in the community in which we live. So one of the things increasingly I am having conversations about is, and it comes back to another word you used earlier, which is trust.
Yeah.
The law and the legal profession and the system around that, the decision-making process is critical to in the stability around trust of the system, because that perception of how someone interacts with the system or the experience they have with the system will define, trust in, whether the government is actually creating good policy that's turning into good legislation, whether decisions are being made that are actually fair and equitable and people are having their appropriate say through the process. The law is actually one of the more unique professions, I would say, that does sit at the intersection, as you said, of how civil society works. It is a bit of a, it's not all about the rules, but it is a bit of a rule book as to how that works. It's also the checks and balance on the system, because the law is there to check the executive government to say, is what you're doing within the powers of which we as citizens have given you through constitutions or whatever it might be, that say you're able to do that on our behalf or to us. And at the same time, at an individual level, it's the check on balance to say, am I agreeing to the moral contract I have as a citizen of, Victoria in my case, or Australia in more broad sense, within the framework that we have actually enabled people to operate. So increasingly, I think that's why I was saying I'm talking about that, because increasingly I am getting concerned some of the noise is taking away the importance of what these systems do. And rather than actually understanding why those systems are there and how we might, could improve them or adjust them, there's too often attacks on the system, which therefore undermines the credibility. And you hear people talk about credibility institutions. And, a lot of the things, institutions aren't infallible, but once you start to lose credibility in institutions, you lose credibility in the system or trust in the system, that's what is anarchy. And anarchy is not necessarily a positive thing for communities, because often in anarchy it's a power shift, and those who are more disempowered don't necessarily do any better out of that sort of situation, whereas the system is actually designed to try and, as best as it can, provide a voice and access to everybody within it. So very long answer to that, Cathy, but it is one that I am increasingly, challenged by and challenging.
I can relate on so many levels. I have so many discussions on a global basis with that sort of framework in mind in which you shared. I guess one of the things that, constantly comes to mind, particularly with the rapid changes, of technology at the moment, we create the system that is enhanced through technology, but how do we actually do that? And usually what actually happens is the framework is built by the technicians with the people that are perhaps actually not within the system, as in those that we are actually there to serve, but from an operational point of view. And at times we actually miss the objective. Are we actually serving, the people at the very core through the actual automation processes that don't necessarily actually have that critical thinking of what is actually needed at the root of, who we're actually serving? And my question often comes to, do we have the right people at the table? And every time my answer is, I don't think we do. Because we're not looking at it through that lens. What are your thoughts around that?
I think so. I think sometimes that's true. And I think part of it is, one of the challenges I actually think is, we often say it's important to have lived experience around the table. But everyone's lived experience is different. So it can't be. So it's about how do you have enough lived experience to get the right framing, without also, my experience to your experience with the system or process might be fundamentally different because of, how you think and how I think, and all of those things, how we all brought up, and the experience we've actually encountered. But we do need to have a more open conversation around not only the lived experience, but what is the causal effect of some of this stuff. So if I can talk a bit in a legal context, because I think it's an easy one to try and explain. In this country, there's a lot of conversation at the moment around things like youth crime, or and so the narrative then turns to, okay, tough on crime. And that narrative is coming about because there is a societal reaction which is built on fear and also lived experience for some of the issues that has been happening from members of our society, whether they be young kids or other offenders. And that is a valid response. But what sometimes gets missed in that is, okay, how did we get there? So, and again, there are some people who may be born evil, for want of a better term, but most people aren't born bad. Most people have gone through an experience, whether it be home, childhood, mental health, whatever it might be, addiction. it may have brought them to there. Lack of education, access to education, lack of supports, lack of role models. How do we cauterize the problem when the problem is too far advanced? And all we do is we might put somebody in jail at an extreme end and go, we feel safe now. But that person in jail is not necessarily going to be getting better because they're going to be exposed to other people who are not necessarily nice, members of society. Rather than fixing that end, how do we stop it getting there in the first place? And one of the things, and again, I'm really strong on at the moment is, how do we make sure that kids are getting access to education? How do we make sure that those kids who may be vulnerable in this situation have the right supports? I mean, we have a job as a society not to say, I am scared now. We should be saying, I'm sorry for how I've let you get there, and what's our obligation to have stopped it? You can't always stop it. So no system's perfect, but we've got to stop looking at the end outcome, and rather than that, you've still got to deal with that because you can't say this behaviour is always acceptable. But how do I actually intervene at the beginning at a systems level and talk to the people who actually maybe got there to say, what would have made a difference to you? How could we have taken you on a different pathway, a different trajectory? And in the end, in that context, the community is safer because people don't do the crime in the first place because they feel connected to their society. They feel part of a community. Yeah, I think that's something we need to keep talking about.
I cannot actually be more in alignment with what you have actually said. And that goes to my point of how are we creating systems, how are we creating policy, because that long-term vision, I call that part of, the black swan theory, the anti-fragile framework that Nassim Taleb actually, has curated. When we actually apply second, third, fourth, sixth, seventh order thinking, we are actually looking at preventative measures, not what's actually in front of us just now. Because if we are just plugging a hole, guess what? It's leaking through the bottom. We can keep pouring and topping up the soil at the top, but it's still actually, running off at the bottom. And I think that is probably the most critical aspect of systems thinking and building when we don't have the right people at the table, because we're looking at a different outcome. We're looking at a short-term outcome as opposed to how do we actually prevent ourselves from even getting here. And that applies across everything, that we do. So I love that you've raised that because that actually includes our well-being. It includes our health. I want to know that my grandchildren's grandchildren are actually going to have a really different environment to where we're living today. And that's the type of thing that I think is missing in today's society.
There's another piece in that I think is missing, and again, I loosely call it civics education, type stuff. It's understanding our role as a society and how we fit and our obligations in that. And I think there's an interesting leadership dichotomy challenge, however you want to put it, at the moment, because trying to get cut through on some of these things is actually really, really complicated in today's environment. And part of it is because of things like that. There's news, fake news, real news, however you want to describe it, but there's content, I'll call it content. There is content being pushed out all the time, which is informing people's opinions because people don't have a lot of time to actually necessarily consume content or go and explore or investigate. So we have an environment where you're trying to cut through on a narrative that you can't get through because it's a noisy environment. So there's a leadership dichotomy and challenges. So how do I cut through? Because, I use that example before on crime. I'm the first to acknowledge people are scared and there is poor behaviour and there is some very violent behaviour in some of our citizens and they need to be dealt with. They can't be non-consequential. But how do you have another open conversation with communities and society to say, you've got to deal with that, but what's our obligation to do the other stuff at the other end, which is health, education, system fixes, system supports, because we can't blame here and then not take accountability for how things happen. But to try and have that dialogue is really, really complex because no one wants to listen. It's very hard to get people to listen into the right environments because it's not necessarily what sells tickets to the rodeo, so to speak.
It's interesting because I think, you raise a couple of points there. One is what's actually going to get news or a reaction, because everybody's actually looking for that quick, attention fix, not necessarily positive, to actually create more noise. That slowing down piece, I think, is also actually part of the leadership dichotomy that's actually existing. There is no pause button, in leadership. And that actually takes time. Even considering what you've actually just said, about we can have this discussion because we can't actually avoid it. It needs to actually be resolved. There are real issues at hand. But there is a much bigger discussion that needs to take place. And this one's actually going to take a lot more time, a lot more investment. But we're not prepared to look beyond what's actually happening in the immediate future. Does that come down to values, do you think? Where we prioritise the value, of us, ourselves as individuals and also the organisation or the system?
I think there's a bit of that. So, as you know, I think values are core to how people operate, how businesses operate, how, our elected officials operate, all those things. You need to have some sense of value or purpose or, centre. But I think part of it is also, I think, I don't want to blame tech, but technology it almost masked a lot of stuff, and because it has enabled us to avoid social interactions. It's enabled us to, and again, I look at ways even, my children interact with each other now. I will say, have you picked up the phone and spoken to them? Have you, why don't you go and have a conversation with them? It's all text, or it's, what's that other thing that disappears? Those other apps, I'm some age. But it's almost like a creep has happened. And so I don't think values have necessarily shifted as much. So I think values have become messed up with a system and environment that you are less able to live or demonstrate your values because you don't have that same connectivity. I mean, that's probably a very garbled response to your question, but it's quite a complex one, because I don't think, again, I talk to people all the time. Everyone I talk to, I do think come from a purpose of, a good position or have values. Whether their values and my values align, that's a different issue. But people do have a sense of values and purpose. But it's how you can actually demonstrate those and how you can actually probably connect each other's values together, which I think is getting harder because of the system, and tech's been part of that. Obviously, our discombobulation through the COVID period, because obviously we actually separated each other from each other. And you see that manifest out with kids and, learning and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's, I don't think it's, so I think values have a part to play, but I'm not sure it's the driver, because I think the values to a lot of people are still there. It's just, I think they'll get lost in the quagmire.
I agree that values are there. I'm not quite sure that people actually pay attention to them, which almost goes back to where we started. That links into the performative aspect, because we can talk to it, we can automate it, but if we don't actually live it, then are we being authentic? Are we being the whole of ourselves? I think the automation process, the ease of where technology, because I look at it, it's a tool, but somehow it's not actually, I'm going to say, enveloped that way. We have become reliant on it and almost actually accept it as it is fact, as opposed to we need to actually reference that. Whatever we're actually receiving, it needs to still be checked from a reference point of view. So I don't disagree that people actually talk about values, but I don't think that they embody them. And there is a significant difference. And that is, to me, where the authenticity of consciousness actually sits. If you do not embody it, then to me, that actually then becomes performative, because everybody can talk to it. That automated system has actually given them language, even depth of language, to actually talk in the most complex of ways, but they don't embody it.
And I think that's probably true. And I think then that I do think the core, it's there. I think people find it harder and harder in the system to know how they can actually demonstrate their values, whether it be through fear, whether it be through how people are going to respond to them. It's, I do think, so I genuinely, again, maybe I'm a bit Pollyanna, I do think at the heart of most people, there is a genuine belief in a value set. It's about whether they feel comfortable enough to demonstrate them, live them, show them in the way that you and I are talking about, and whether the system facilitates that almost being pushed down or suppressed a bit in that process. So I'm probably a bit more Pollyanna-ish in that I think that at the heart, most people do have a values structure, because I even see it with even though the way our kids were brought up versus the way we were brought up, I can still see in our kids and their friends that there is values, and they will shift from how ours may have been. But it's how do they turn up and how do they show up with those values and how do they feel comfortable doing that, the issue.
Maybe I can actually sort of redirect that in, we're looking at potentially 4 different generations actually living at the same time now that have gone through significant changes to our ecosystem. So if I was to actually say to you, what are perhaps moments or a moment that you have actually seen shift in the way that either you lead or that leaders as a whole, lead today to perhaps what may have occurred, 3 generations ago?
Well, at a very rudimentary level, I would say, again, as much as COVID can be seen as from through good or bad, depending which lens people want to talk about it, I think COVID actually did disrupt the way you lead and the way you accept to lead. And again, I will use working from home as an example. And again, it's a very small example. But society is demanding now. The way we as human beings and what we expect of each other, it's no longer the, Ward and June Cleaver, dad goes off to work in a suit and tie, mum stays home and, makes the beds and all that sort of stuff, and neither should it be. We have a society that, we want and enable equity depending on people's choice. But that also puts pressure in the system. COVID, I think, recalibrated some of that. And again, I look at it through my own lens, Pre-COVID, I probably would have said, well, work was the most important thing. I'll go to work and, the family can just work through that. That's fine. I'll always be at work. I expect my staff to be at work because that's what you do. But now there is a different way of looking at leadership and say, well, actually, it's not about being physically present. It's are you present in your job and how are you delivering outcomes and impact? That's, yes, I do think it's gone too far some ways, but I think you need to, because again, as humans, we do need to work with each other. So working from home all the time is not necessarily healthy either. But as a leader, I'm comfortable now working from home because that's actually might be a time where I can actually recenter myself to be able to give the best of myself when I am present in the office to my staff. Because, being a leader is actually very energy draining because you are not only worrying about where you're going, you're worrying about where everyone else is going, where your environment's going. Yeah. I wouldn't have done that before COVID. I would have said, you've got to be at work. But it's also other things such as, and as you know, and you mentioned it at the beginning, I've also had to try and find ways that I've got to disconnect myself. So I pot now. I spend my time on potting wheels, centering clay to center myself because, and again, if you asked me before COVID, would I have ever done that? No, probably not. Would I have been embarrassed as a middle-aged male saying I've now gone to do pottery? I probably would have, and I wouldn't have told anybody that I do that. Whereas now I go, I'm happy to say that's how I find my ability to center. Some people meditate, some people will do yoga, some people will run, but I've found what works for me, and I'm happy to tell people. And I'm not embarrassed telling people because I think people need to know as a leader, I'm okay that I might go and do a pottery class or spend some time on the pottery wheel. I might work from home today, and it's okay. It enables and empowers you to think about how you want to lead.
There's 2 things that, if I might pick up on that, I remember I was actually speaking across the country, and it was actually to the financial sector pre-COVID. And the very topic interestingly, you know, we're talking about 7 years ago now, it was actually consciousness in leadership, and also actually looking at what else. I look at what else as a really good narrative to work from as a baseline instead of asking what if. And my question at the time was, what else do you think might be possible if you actually have a bit more flexibility in the workplace? Why is it that we need to have the rigor of the 9 to 5 or 8 to whatever it is, right? So that was in November of 2019. And I remember actually receiving emails back from different people across Australia saying to me, when you were talking about that, did you know about COVID? And my response was, well, no, I didn't. I don't have a crystal ball. But it was actually allowing a different conversation to arise. And I had a lot of objection, you know. But my point was, to what you just said, isn't the importance in understanding that we are working towards a particular cohesive, collaborative outcome, rather than actually seeing somebody sitting behind a desk until 7 p.m. being unproductive, but somehow we're measuring it that way, right? So that's the very first point.
Oh, but also, you know, again, I go back and go, you know, and I think more about this now, or as I probably did it before. If I'm tired, and again, you know, these jobs are tiring, you know. People often say, you know, leadership, CEO roles are probably one of the loneliest roles because you've got everyone looking up at you, you've got your board looking down at you, your stakeholders looking for you from every side which way, and not many people we can talk to. I am not going to be my best for my people, for my stakeholders, for my members, if I'm tired and just coming to work because I feel like I've got to perform. As opposed to if I'm comfortable now, which I am, and saying, actually, I just need to, you know, take some time in the morning and go for a walk, and you know, I'll get done what I need to get done when I can get to it. That's actually a better outcome for the people I'm trying to serve, because I'm recognising I need to recharge my energy base, whatever that looks like. As I would say before, and to your point, and like what you were trying to have those conversations before COVID, is any system does not work if you know, it's like a car. A car is a system. If you are not maintaining and fixing, and that's why we service our car. If you're not servicing your car, it won't continue to perform at the level you need it to. Our bodies are systems, and if we are not stopping, as I'm talking to the choir, I know with you, but like our bodies are systems. If we're not actually stopping and actually recognising when our own system needs a break, how can we be the best for the other people within the system?
I love that you actually raised that, because it is such an important conversation. You know, we have created echo chambers, I'm going to say, within specific industries. You know, it's probably more prevalent than others, where, you know, people, titles, professions, jobs need to look like this. Yet we are actually human beings. We are human-centred. You know, so actually allowing people or enabling people, or for people to actually feel like it's a trusted environment to show up as the whole of themselves is another topic that I have talked about, you know, for decades now. And so I'm so glad that you actually, you know, shared that element of that creativity part of you, because that's another thing I think, you know, has actually been a conditioning. We need to look a particular way, but we're also told, you know, that if you actually are a critical thinker, you are not a creative thinker. So you're either left-brained or you're right-brained, and you're actually just, you know, reinforcing, again, what I've said for decades now, is that no, actually, we have the ability to do both, you know, and that may actually change over time, but it doesn't mean that we are either or. We are a whole person, and I think that's so important, particularly for our younger people, to actually hear that. And touching on that piece that you actually, you know, shared, you center yourself through pottery. Do you know that actual kinesthetic approach that, you know better than me because it's your skill set, but in actually touching the clay and in creating something that actually needs to be centered actually recalibrates, your nervous system. And so can I actually ask you to perhaps actually share a little bit of what you experience through that actual process and how that actually brings clarity into the work that you do, because we don't actually pause long enough to genuinely understand what it actually does, to our nervous system that actually then feeds our actual thoughts.
Well, again, it's interesting. Clay is of the earth. Clay is of the earth. The earth has been here longer than we, as individuals. One of the things that I find with clay, and it's actually very empowering, but it's also very humbling, is I can't control the clay. So I've got to work with the clay. And so I don't know whether, any of your viewers have actually tried pottery, but pottery is actually about, centering your clay. And if you don't center your clay, you will end up with it might be very organic, but it's very, not necessarily the most attractive looking piece of pottery. And for some people, that's okay. But if you actually are wanting to master this art, which again, I don't think you can ever master it because, people have been doing it for centuries. It is actually, you've got to work with the clay. You've got to find the rhythm of the clay. You have to listen to the clay, but also the fact that, as I said, it is of the earth and your hands are back, ultimately, you go back from a very primal, primitive perspective, our connection back to land and earth and country is you are actually having your hands back in the earth, and that's a very natural, obviously feeling. But working with the clay to then work through where does the clay want to go to actually help you create what you're trying to create to represent through the clay. So it is a very, and again, it's only been over the last, probably 12 months. And again, as I've gone further into my pottery journey and, you listen to people who have been doing this for a long time and some of the masters, and that's very much what they talk about. It's the clay is an extension of, back to the earth, but also you can't control it. And the more you try to force control it, the worse the outcome will be. And again, I'm the first to say, I haven't got that mastered all the time. But again, you have to release control. And again, in leadership, sometimes you need to be able to release so I then bring it back to the question around how you lead and whatever. Sometimes you need to be able to release control because you can't. The more you try to force it, the more it will become unstable versus trying to work out how you go with the flow to try and get the right outcome and have the right impact on what you're trying to achieve. So clay for me is actually a large extension now of how I see things. And also, as my pottery teacher says to me, my pots will be here long after I am, again, because they're of the earth. And ultimately we go back to the earth. And, when you think about it in the circle of life, clay will last. What is it? One thing that people discover through archaeology and, digs is pottery.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That is, again, because it's a connection back to the earth and the clay.
So if I actually then link that to a piece that we talked about earlier, what you're actually doing is you're not thinking about just in that moment. You're also relinquishing the control to actually better understand how that actual piece of pottery might last well beyond your actual time on this earth, which is coming back to that systems order thinking,
right.
That's actually generations ahead. We want things to last beyond our actual life cycle. And I often say to people, when you make a decision and when you look back at the last breath that you take, what is it that you actually want to say? That, yes, I've done. And your pottery and the way that you lead and the way that you engage and the way that you actually interconnect is actually really important.
Before you ask the question, but also it's interesting, but again, a bit like leadership. So when you pot, the end outcome that I produce will be different than if you were to do it.
Of course.
And so again, back to how you lead, at a leadership level, and again, it's one thing I often say to people is, you have to have people who say they haven't got an ego as a leader are telling you the biggest porcupines because we all have ego. It's about how do you apply ego for outcome. And so, the reality is I will make something and it will reflect me. It'll be my stamp, my style. In leadership and in system change, I am also, I've still got to work within it, and I've got to let it guide me, but I am also making my impact or my imprint onto that change or that system outcome. And that's exactly the same as a clay. It's not like I am removed from it. I am working with it. I am part of it, and I am trying to get my imprint, my impact on it. And that's exactly what you're trying to do as a leader, is how do I leave my, not legacy, I don't like legacy so much, but it's how do I leave my impact, and how do I, when I meet my maker, I know that I have done what I can do, leave the best result for those who come after me. That's what you try to do as a leader, and it's no different than when I'm throwing a bit of clay.
Yeah, it's so valid. As you were sharing that, I was also actually thinking about the interconnected piece. That integration is actually so vital in leadership, in the system. If we actually listen to better understand the impact of everybody that's actually involved, then we come to a different outcome. And that's, I think, what you're doing as you're feeling through the clay. You are literally actually asking almost consensus and ideas of how to actually shape that. We don't tend to do that, as leaders, or particularly less so with the enhancement of technology, because we're focused on one thing. Let's actually get this done by this time frame, but not necessarily thinking about the roll-on effect, of anybody else.
And technology is a good one. I mean, as you were doing that, to me, it's about in this context, how could you use technology to help improve and pull up the system where people may be disadvantaged. And again, in the world I work in, there's a lot of conversation around AI and Gen AI and tech. But I'm again optimistic, and I look at it, well, how do you use that to enable people to understand the system better, to get access to the system better, to improve their experience with the system better, to make judgments that actually might keep them out of the system, because they know actually on balance, I now know that it's, this approach may not be the best outcome for me. It's how do you use these tools and these artifacts to look through and say, how can I use them for improvement and having impact, not just to get a task done. The task is the task, but think beyond the task and think, well, if I can improve that task, how does it improve the system? How does it improve the outcome for the person in the system?
Do you know, as I was listening to you just then, and you were talking about from a systems, one of the projects that I actually remember I was involved on quite some time ago was systems built. It was actually, tech-based. As the actual, I'm going to say the coders were actually involved in facilitating what we had explained was the outcome. The lens in which they actually sat to build was through what they actually understood. They are subject matter experts in coding, but not necessarily understanding, because we sit at an intermediary stage. What we were building was actually going to be an interface for a customer. So we were looking at it from a customer perspective, giving the instructions. But if they don't fully understand and have experienced it, from a customer perspective, they're still actually going to code the way that they actually understand coding. And what that does is it creates patches, right? Let's do this. We're building on top, which is what we were talking about before. We keep filling at the top. But then what happens is that end user and the intermediary don't actually know where all of those patches are. So how do we fix it? That's to the point, right?
That is to the point. Yeah, the other bit of that, though, is I'd say, and I think this is sometimes the downfall of systems thinking, is you don't want to stifle innovation within the system, within pockets either. So you've got to have the system working well enough that it's got a level of comfort that there could be a pocket over here that might have a unique customer experience or a unique, and they are actually best placed to go and play, test it. As long as they're bringing it back into the system to work at, to your point, how do we fit it in and actually, mean to grow it within the system as opposed to it being all isolated. It also can't go the other way and say we all need to do everything through a systems thinking lens, because the system that can also stifle innovation. stifle creativity. So it's trying to find the balance between the system architecture at the top, but where are the nuggets of gold and the innovation and the creativity around the system that you want to encourage to flourish within the system to get the better outcome? Because sometimes the system is going to take too long to change, but you can actually start to change things from within, if that makes sense.
And no, that's exactly what I'm actually talking about. And this is where I think, I started off, I think you sit at a really unique, position and at the intersection of a whole array of different systems and processes. And it's something that I know that I have the privilege of from a global perspective in how I see things a bit differently, particularly where culture comes in. When we can actually have people sitting at the table in their place of genius. And to your point earlier, yes, we do need ego. Ego also actually mitigates risk. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. We do need it. The checking point is actually the most critical part, bringing those people, I'm going to go back, bringing the right people to the table with respect to actually have differences of opinions actually heard is the critical part. And I think that's one thing that, if this conversation does nothing else, it's actually to bring that to awareness. How do we actually equip that, Adam, to actually be part of the forum and perhaps to actually be the preventative measure, in everything that we do? How do we bring those discussions to the foreplay?
How, again, part of it, I think, is not only how, but it's also the who. So, and the reason I say that is, and as you know, you and I have had conversations even within my organisation. I don't necessarily need to sit on all of my executive meetings on because I've got a title. By the same token, my leaders don't necessarily need to be the ones at the table either. If the right people at the table is, if it's the person who's down this part of the process, but they're the ones who've got the right experience, lived knowledge, whatever it might be, and also potentially the different perspectives to challenge some of that. It's also about how do you create the system where, and this is where you've got to actually flip on the ego stuff and say, well, actually, it's not about title or position. It's about who's the right person to bring to the table, to the room, to start to shift that dialogue, because that's where you get the richness and the power when people are comfortable enough to say, I'm okay not to be in the room because I'm not the right person. Go and speak to Cathy or go and speak to Fred or Mary because they have an experience that I would only be reflecting on what I understand versus what I know.
And also, to an earlier point that you raised, we both raised, was creating the trust, for people to actually be open, just like you shared, perhaps a decade ago you would not have actually shared that you have pottery as a hobby or, a hobby farm or, you enjoy, actually breathing through the day, and walking on grass. How do we create that environment where genuine trust is actually felt? Because people need to feel it to genuinely actually, be able to then communicate. And that takes time. Without actually having people feel like they're less than because they're not actually the ones sitting at the table and that's what they're accustomed to.
Yeah, I think that is the ongoing question and the ongoing conversation. And, as leaders, all we can do is keep sharing ourselves or sharing our thoughts. And again, sometimes it might be sharing, so look, today I'm not having a great day, I'm not going to be my best today, whatever it might be. But actually say to other people, I want to empower you to do so. I need you. I'm empowering you to take that lead. I'm empowering you to give me a whack around the chops if you think I'm not doing the right thing, because I'm not perfect. We're people, and people aren't perfect.
Yeah.
So, that's the thing that I think we've got to keep looking at is how do we invite and embrace people in, but also how do we empower people that also push back on us as leaders? Because, the reality is, I'm conscious that my title carries weight that sometimes is needed, but it's not always necessarily a healthy thing because I am not the expert. I am, as I use pottery again, I will be on a journey of learning with that for my life. Leadership is a journey for your life. I am The moment I go, I've got this nailed, I think it's time for me to check out and do something different.
I can't agree with you more. And I think that's actually another false belief system that, when we sit in a position that actually holds any sort of title of importance, somehow we think we've landed. That is so much further, from the truth. When people actually say to me, I've done work on myself, I know exactly where they're sitting, because it doesn't stop. One of the things that I say, particularly, when I'm in a room that has got some pretty, I'm going to say, people that hold, a lot of position of power and influence, it's actually practicing living. It doesn't stop. You are always actually at the interchange of being a student and actually being a teacher. That doesn't stop. So that perception, at times where we actually sit in a, in a leadership role is that I need to actually know it all. No, we don't.
Oh, and you use a word, they're just in power. And roles, again, this is, through history, roles, positions come with a perception of certain levels of power and therefore, deference and trust and all that sort of stuff that goes with that. In the modern era, I think it's how do you, if you have power, and I don't really like the word, but it is reality that there is power in position, but how do you use that power you've got to somewhat, in some ways, disempower yourself to give the power to others in a process or system while making sure you're obviously still delivering your impact, but also being genuine in your power, because power's a gift. It's not a right. Even if you are elected into certain offices, and I don't want to go into what's going across the, because there's stuff we could talk for hours about some of that stuff around the world. But, power is not a right. We all come in, two ways, nowadays through modern medicine, the traditional way or the zipper. And the reality is we all come out screaming, hopefully. And, we all need to be nourished by your parents and all that sort of stuff. How we are shaped after that journey is different, and you don't come out, even though they're obviously the history roles, in like monarchs, in monarchies and that sort of stuff, that is birthright. The reality is no one's got a right to anything over somebody else. It is just a circumstance, and power is one of those. And if you are privileged enough to have a position that provides you with some power or authority, it's how do you use that? And I think that's the thing as a society we need to question more as to how do those who have power use that, and are they actually using that for the right purposes for impact for a better society, a better community, and also to actually help those, particularly in our society, who are somewhat powerless. And increasingly we are seeing more people who are powerless in our society, which we have an obligation to support.
You've actually hit the nail on the head for me. It is exactly what you've just said. When you hold a position of power, it is an absolute privilege. What you do with it is entirely going to be reflective of who you actually are as a person. That actual gap that you mentioned is actually widening by the second. And it's the reason why I actually do the work that I do. You mentioned the word empowering. People have the ability to actually enable themselves to choose to do things differently. And that's what we hopefully is a lesson in life. We can choose to actually leave this place in a better situation than when we found it. That goes back to that, second, third, fourth order thinking aspect and how we actually step into any framework. Adam, I think you and I can actually talk forever. But if I were to say to you, people that will actually be listening to this, what is the one message that you would want them to take away from what we have actually discussed today?
I'd say the one message I would ask for to take away or to think about is, what's your role in the system? What can you do differently? Don't feel you are disempowered, you're voiceless. we as a community, this is our community. It's no one else's. So if you want change, how do you actually try and support change or agitate for change? And it can be in the most. It doesn't all have to be big. It can be microcosm in a system. Because sometimes it's the littlest bits in a system that can actually have the biggest impact from a change perspective. So I'd say, firstly, don't be afraid to actually to step in and lean into that. The second thing is, if you're a leader, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be yourself, because, as I said, power's a privilege. The more you can actually share that power to get a better outcome for the people you serve, the people we live with, the better off our kids and our grandkids' generations will be, because we're shifting the narrative away from ourselves to a community and society. I think that's the key thing now. We've got to move away from the me to the we.
I love that. Well, that's actually living consciously, right? Living as a collective, not in isolation. Thank you, Adam. I'm going to wrap up here. So anybody that's actually listening, that message from Adam is so critical. Every single person has the opportunity and the ability to actually be the change. And it doesn't matter whether you are in a position of title or even how old you are or where you are actually located, from a geographical position. Be the change that you actually want to see in the world. That's the message that I got. Thank you, Adam, for your time.
Thanks, Cathy.
Always a pleasure.
This was Let's Pay Attention, Hacking Consciousness. Stay awake, lead with heart, be bold enough to listen deeply. I'm Cathy Dimarchos. Until next time, be the impact.